Hello again, Maplers. I've come to the realization that a lot of y'all in game ask the same questions, either to me, guilds, alliances, discords, etc. I often hear questions like, what is IED? Or, how much IED do I need for boss X? I have this much IED, but when I add another source, it doesn't really go up. Why is that? Well, when are you going to do a face reveal? When are you going to do a gender reveal? Why haven't you paid back the money you owe me from Squid Game? I definitely see you all talking about this in Maple, so I've decided I'll cover one portion of these questions. That's right, I have the money, and I'll meet up with you in a second, right after I cover the question on everyone's mind. What's IED? Ignore enemy defense, aptly named IED. The description reads, the higher your IED, the better you penetrate your enemy's defenses. Of course, what else could this mean? Additionally, it states that this value applies up to 100%. It's a little misleading. Rather, you can never really go up to 100%, nor would you want to. To better understand what IED is, we have to revisit the original PDR and IED system that Nexon implemented when it all started. Everything that you can penetrate in this game, attack, has a value that is called PDR, otherwise known as percent damage reduction. As its name implies, this is how much of your damage gets reduced by their defenses. This value doesn't really matter for mobs, since it's so low, and you should be able to one-shot regular mobs anyway. However, for bosses, it's a different story, since they have a lot more HP. In the old days, PDR was split into physical damage reduction, also named PDR, and MDR, known as magic damage reduction. Your IED would be compared to this value based on your weapon or magic attack that would result in your damage that you would deal. Nexon decided that with more classes and other quirky features like Arc's magic attack conversion, this would get too convoluted to implement, so they bundled it all into one and made it PDR as we know it today. Now, you'll most likely just ask, why can't I just use a calculator, or look at my current stat window to determine how much I need? The formula for calculating IED is multiplicative, so it's hard to guess how much you're going to receive the more IED you have. Another thing to keep in mind is something called visual IED and effective IED. You'll hear that term tossed around a lot. Visual IED is the IED that you see on your stat window, while effective IED is how much you'll have for a specific attack or a skill. Certain class skills, link skills, hyper skills, and even node stone levels will give you effective IED, not the other way around. Knowing where you can get all your sources of IED from will greatly help you maximize your damage against bosses. Let's take a look at something called diminishing return. This basically just means that if you invest some resource, let's say for example, you borrowed some money into a potentially shady game that sounds kind of like a squid, and maybe put in 50,000 at first, well, the return is the amount of enjoyment I get from seeing people fight to the demonstrate the principles of society. Let's say I get 100 points of enjoyment from the first game. As I keep investing hundreds of thousands more, I get less and less enjoyment out of each game because there's less and less people to demonstrate the principles of society. As I invest more $50,000 sums, the less returns I get per investment. And before you know it, you've thrown away $500,000 and the debtors are knocking at your door every other day. Funny story, isn't it? Well, anyway, basically, IED is kind of like that, except the more IED you invest, the less return you get from the same amount of IED source. Let's take a look at the math to better showcase what I mean. IED is calculated by multiplying each source of IED separately. This value is calculated by first multiplying the largest sources of IED first. If your only source of IED is one source of 30%, your IED is 30. If you have two sources of 30% and one source of 10%, then your IED is 55.9 on your stat window. If you keep going, you'll see that the closer you get to 100, the less return you'll get from the smaller sources of IED. You'll want to strike a balance between having enough IED that you can damage bosses without having your damage reduced by a large enough portion. Once you have your IED value, you'll then want to compare it to the boss's PDR, as mentioned from earlier. Most bosses where IED matter will be anywhere between 200 to 300. Say for example, the IED you see on your stat window is 93%. This means that when attacking a boss with 200 PDR, for example Chaos Vellum, you will do this formula in damage. You can actually replace the IED value for the percentage here and you can replace the other respective numbers with the boss's PDR, and that will determine your damage output. Similarly, with bosses with 300% PDR, it would be this formula. It's usually up to personal preference, HP, and PDR, but I always try to go for a minimized reduction of at least 80% damage output or higher. This means for bosses like Chaos Rudibus, you can fight them with a lower IED value. While doing bosses like Lotus, Damien, Lucid, or Will, they require you to have a higher range of IED. Personally, I want to sit somewhere between 94 to 96 visual IED at all times, depending on progression. Obviously, the harder the boss, the more IED you'll need. That's why it's so vital for high visual IED for Seren, since she has 380 PDR as opposed to every other boss in the game. Most players usually aim for 98 or 99% IED. Now that we know how to calculate IED, let's take a look at the different sources you can find in MapleStory Reboot that will provide IED. 5% from Fafnir Top, 5% from Fafnir Bottom, and 10% from the Fafnir and Absolab hats. If you're choosing to go the expensive route, you can actually go the Arcane hat, which provides the 15% instead of 10%. You can also get 10% on the Absolab Arcane or Overalls, but it's not recommended since using an overall is always worse than a top or a bottom. Fafnir and Absolab weapons will provide 10% IED, while the Arcane variant will provide 20%. You can also get 10% from the Monster Parker medal. With the upcoming changes to Reboot, you can actually soon purchase a 10% IED badge for about 105 bill, or just go for 15 bill for a single day. For titles, you can obtain the Root Abyss Master, which provides 5% IED, but there are alternative titles, so if you find a different one, go for it. You can also randomize a Magnificent Soul weapon, and depending on the tier, it'll vary between 3% to 7%. There are 5 badges that provide 3% IED per badge, but this is not to be confused with the badge slot. This is actually in reference to the badges in your Familiars tab. In Reboot, you can feasibly only get the Mineral badge and the Time badge. The Time badge may take a bit more luck, since it requires field boss cards, which are pretty low drop rate. You can also get 1, 2, 3, 5, and 6% IED for the Blaster and Beast Tamer Legion cards, based off of the Legion levels of 60, 100, 140, 200, and 250 per card tier. On the Legion board itself, you can allocate up to 40% of IED, depending on how much of the Legion board you've unlocked and filled up. There's also the Elusive Pitch boss set, which provides 10 IED on third line. Equipping a full set of Superior Golics will provide 30% IED, but this is only applicable to regions that have Golics, obviously. Having a 4 set or higher of Abso or Arcane will provide a 10% set effect as well. Reaching level 100 Ambition in your trait will also allow for 10% IED. As for your weapon secondary and emblem, you can roll IED on those, but it really depends. Generally, you'll want to reserve those lines for weapon, attack, or magic attack percent, or boss damage. For some classes though, you may need additional IED. With the Familiar revamp, you can also get sources of IED from those cards as well. Aiming for unique in Reboot is what you should strive for, and since larger sources are calculated first, a single line of 30% IED is slightly better than 2 lines of 15% IED, since each line counts as 2 separate sources. Additionally, there are also link skills that I should mention that provide IED. Skills like Luminous, Zero, and Ho Young contribute to your visual IED, but the Explorer Magician links count toward your effective IED only. Now, if all that confused you or went over your head, I can recommend a calculator that I've always used since starting Reboot. The app shown is the premium version, and it's super accurate. With the introduction of this new app, it feels even easier to use than before, and has a bunch of stuff that is not just revolved around IED. So feel free to head on over to Delusion Dash's Patreon and check out the link in the description below. While you're at it, it would be really great if you could support the channel by beeping the subscribe button and booping the like button. In the meantime, while you do all that, I've got some diminishing returns to sort out.